Welcome to a story that will drift you into peaceful sleep. Close your eyes and let your mind wander to a small town where the impossible became reality, where a man walked through his own funeral doors and changed everything anyone thought they knew about life and death. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in Millbrook, population 3,000 and change, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest news is usually Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning tomatoes or the high school football team making it to regionals. But this Tuesday morning, something happened that would have people talking for decades. Harold Whitman, 62 years old, had been reported missing 3 days prior. His wife Margaret called the police when he didn't come home from his evening walk. Harold was a creature of habit, you see. Every day at 6:30 sharp, he'd lace up his brown leather shoes and take the same route through Millbrook's quiet streets, down Maple Avenue, past the old church, around the town square, and back home by 7:15. But that Friday, 7:15 came and went, then 7:30, then 8. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the street, her hands wringing the dish towel she'd been holding for the past hour. Harold had never been late, not once, in 37 years of marriage. The police found his body Saturday morning in Miller's Creek, about 2 miles outside town. At least, they thought it was his body. The man was wearing Harold's clothes, had Harold's wallet, even had what appeared to be Harold's distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident with a fishing hook. The body was bloated and damaged from being in the water, making identification difficult. But every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. Harold Whitman was dead. Dr. Patricia Vance, the town's medical examiner, performed what examination she could given the state of the remains. Water damage, she explained to Margaret, could make definitive identification challenging. But the height, approximate weight, clothing, and personal effects all matched. The dental records would take weeks to process, but there was no reason to doubt what seemed obvious. Margaret, devastated and in shock, made the funeral arrangements. She chose Harold's favorite blue suit, the one he'd worn to their daughter's wedding. She selected the mahogany casket he'd pointed out years ago when they'd walked past the funeral home, joking about how it looked sturdy enough to last forever. She wrote his obituary, describing a man who'd worked 40 years at the paper mill, who'd never missed a church service, who'd taught Sunday school and coached Little League baseball. The funeral was set for Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock. All of Millbrook showed up. Harold had been one of those people everyone liked, even if they didn't know him well. He'd wave from his evening walks, help neighbors with their groceries, and always had a kind word for the kids walking to school. The church was packed, with people standing in the back and spilling out into the parking lot. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy. He spoke about Harold's quiet faith, his dedication to his family, his gentle spirit. Margaret sat in the front pew, dabbing her eyes with tissues that her sister kept handing her. Their daughter Sarah had driven up from Atlanta with her 2 young children, who kept asking in loud whispers why Grandpa was sleeping in the big box. The service was nearly over. Pastor Williams was just beginning the final prayer when the church doors opened. At first, nobody looked. People were used to latecomers slipping in quietly during services. But then someone gasped, then another, and another. A murmur started in the back of the church and rolled forward like a wave, growing louder and more urgent with each pew it passed. Harold Whitman walked through those doors. He looked exactly as he had 4 days ago, wearing the same clothes he'd disappeared in, the same khaki pants, the same green flannel shirt, the same brown leather shoes. His hair was disheveled, and he looked confused. like a man who'd just woken up from a deep sleep and couldn't quite remember where he was. The church fell into absolute silence. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Harold stood in the doorway, blinking in the soft morning light filtering through the stained glass windows, his eyes adjusting to the scene before him. He saw the flowers, dozens of arrangements covering the altar, filling the air with the heavy scent of lilies and roses. He saw the casket, polished mahogany gleaming under the sanctuary lights. He saw the people, every face he'd known for years, all turned toward him with expressions of shock and disbelief. And then he saw Margaret. His wife of 37 years sat frozen in the front pew, her face pale as winter snow, her hand clutched to her chest. She was staring at him as if he were a ghost, which in a way he might as well have been. Harold took a tentative step forward, his shoes echoing in the silent church. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and uncertain. "Margaret? What's happening? Why is everyone here?" Pastor Williams, a man who delivered thousands of sermons and thought he'd seen everything in his 40 years of ministry, found himself speechless. He stood behind the pulpit, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his prepared words of comfort and hope suddenly meaningless. It was Sarah who broke the spell. Harold's daughter let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and launched herself from the pew. She ran to her father, throwing her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest to convince herself he was real. "Dad, Dad, is it really you? Where have you been? We thought you were dead. We buried you. We're burying you right now." Harold held his daughter, his own confusion growing by the second. He looked around the church again, taking in the details he'd missed before. The memorial program with his photograph on the cover, the guest book for people to sign their condolences, the flowers arranged in the shape of a cross, the ones Margaret had special ordered from the florist in the next town over. "I don't understand," he said, his voice stronger now but still bewildered. "I was walking. I remember walking, and then I was in the woods, and I was lost. I've been trying to find my way home. I've been walking for what feels like hours, but the sun never seemed to move. And now I'm here, and you're all here, and there's a casket." He stopped, the full weight of the situation beginning to dawn on him. "Is that supposed to be me in there?" Dr. Vance, who'd been sitting near the back, pushed through the crowd. She was a practical woman, trained in facts and evidence, but what she was seeing challenged everything she thought she knew about death and identification. "Harold," she said carefully, "we found a body in Miller's Creek. It was wearing your clothes, carrying your wallet. We thought it was you." Harold patted his pockets absently, then looked down at himself. He was indeed wearing the same clothes he'd put on Friday morning, the same clothes that had been on the body they'd pulled from the creek. "I don't remember any creek," he said. "I remember walking like I always do, but instead of turning back home, I kept going. I felt like I needed to keep walking, like something was pulling me forward. And then I was in the woods, and it was getting dark, but I couldn't find my way back to the road." Margaret had finally found her voice. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and walked toward her husband. She reached out tentatively, as if she were afraid he might disappear if she touched him. "Harold, is it really you?" Her fingers brushed his face, traced the familiar lines around his eyes, touched the scar on his left hand. He was warm, solid, real. This was her husband, the man she'd been married to for 37 years, the man she'd been grieving for 4 days. "It's me, Maggie," he said, using the nickname he'd called her since they were teenagers. "I'm here. I'm sorry I worried you. I don't know what happened, but I'm here now." The church erupted in voices, people talking, crying, laughing, all at once. Some were calling it a miracle. Others were demanding explanations. A few people were already on their phones, trying to call family members who hadn't made it to the funeral. Pastor Williams, finally finding his voice, raised his hands for quiet. "Friends, let's all take a moment to process what's happening here. This is certainly not something any of us expected, but Harold is here. He's safe, and that's what matters most." But questions were already forming. If Harold was here, who was in the casket? Whose body had they pulled from Miller's Creek? And where had Harold been for 4 days? Dr. Vance was already making calls, arranging for the body to be re-examined, for DNA tests to be run. The police would need to reopen their investigation. The funeral home would need to deal with the logistical nightmare of a funeral for a man who was very much alive. Harold, meanwhile, was trying to piece together his missing days. He remembered starting his walk Friday evening, just like always. He remembered feeling restless, like he needed to walk longer than usual. He remembered leaving his normal route and heading toward the outskirts of town. After that, everything became fuzzy. He had vague memories of walking through woods, of being lost, of time seeming to move strangely. Sometimes it felt like he'd been walking for minutes, sometimes for hours. The sun never seemed to set completely, but it never rose either. It was like being caught in an endless twilight. He remembered being hungry but not finding food. He remembered being thirsty but not finding water. He remembered being tired but not being able to sleep. And through it all, he kept walking, driven by something he couldn't name or understand. And then, suddenly, he was standing in front of the church looking at his own funeral. As the shock began to wear off, practical concerns took over. The funeral was canceled, obviously. The reception that was planned for the community center was turned into an impromptu celebration of Harold's return. The flowers were donated to the nursing home. The casket was returned to the funeral home. But the questions remained. Who was the body in Miller's Creek? Where had Harold been for 4 days? And how had he appeared at his own funeral, wearing the same clothes that had been on the corpse? The answers would take weeks to emerge, and when they did, they would be almost as strange as Harold's reappearance. The body in the creek was eventually identified as Robert Mills, a drifter who'd been passing through town. He'd apparently stolen Harold's wallet and some of his clothes from Harold's car, which was found abandoned near the woods where Harold said he'd been walking. Mills had likely drowned trying to cross the creek, possibly while intoxicated, but that still didn't explain where Harold had been, or how he'd survived 4 days in the woods without food or water, or why he looked exactly as he had when he'd disappeared. Harold himself never did remember those 4 days clearly. He would talk about walking in a twilight world, about feeling like he was between places, between moments. Some people suggested he'd had a stroke or some other medical event that had affected his memory. Others whispered about supernatural explanations, about thin places where the boundaries between life and death became blurred. Harold didn't much care about the explanations. He was home, he was with his family, and he was grateful for every ordinary day that followed. He kept taking his evening walks, but he never strayed from his route again. Every night at 7:15 sharp, he'd walk through the front door, and Margaret would be waiting with relief and gratitude that never quite faded. The people of Millbrook eventually stopped talking about it quite so much, but they never forgot. It became the story they told to newcomers, the legend that defined their small town, the man who attended his own funeral, the impossible Tuesday morning when death gave back what it had taken. And sometimes Late at night, when the wind whispered through the trees and the moon cast long shadows across the quiet streets, people would remember that strange day and wonder about the mysteries that hide just beyond the edge of ordinary life. They would think about Harold Whitman walking through the twilight between worlds and somehow finding his way home. Let this story carry you into peaceful sleep, where the impossible becomes possible, where love transcends understanding, and where even the strangest mysteries can have the most beautiful endings. Rest now and dream of homecomings that defy explanation, of love that conquers even death, of ordinary miracles hidden in the fabric of everyday life. And that's the mystery that's haunted the internet for decades. Was it one calculated killer playing an elaborate game, or something far more complex? The evidence points in countless directions, leaving investigators, amateur sleuths, and armchair detectives still searching for answers. Perhaps the truth lies buried in those unsolved ciphers, waiting for someone to crack the code. Or maybe the Zodiac took his secrets to the grave, leaving us forever wondering who was behind the mask. What we do know is that somewhere in the shadows of history, a killer walked free, and that unsolved puzzle continues to captivate us all.